Hi, it's Wednesday, October 22nd. We're tracking Tropical Storm Melissa in the Central Caribbean this afternoon. The system is now crawling across the Central Caribbean. The system has really slowed down in forward motion over the past couple of days. And this slow forward motion is forecast to continue as it gradually starts to lift to the north. And we could see some very heavy rainfall fall in Hispaniola and Jamaica as it stalls very close to both of those islands. Now, the system has gotten a little bit better organized than yesterday. Yesterday, we talked about how there was a very significant vertical tilt with height. So the surface center was way out in advance of all of the convection. And now we've seen that tilt decrease a little bit. You can see the low level center is a little bit closer to all the convection today. Now, in the recent frames of the satellite loop, you can see it is getting a little bit further west of all the convection. And this was confirmed if we look at recon data. They found that the winds are fairly much the same in the convection, but you can see the red or orange dots here getting further away from the center of the convection. So likely an effect of some westerly shear that persists over the storm, now decoupling it even further today. And this is important because the evolution of how the storm developed and intensified over these next few days is key to the eventual track evolution of Melissa. And the number one thing that we talked about yesterday was the uncertainty between models like the GFS and the European model. Now, what we've seen over the past day is a lot of model guidance has come into agreement with the European solution of the system stalling in the Caribbean and staying there for a long time, missing its opportunity to come north. And the reason for that is because the system is not really getting itself vertically stacked like the GFS, for example, is showing. So if we look at the GFS model, this is the mid-level relative humidity, and the wind barbs are the mid-level flow. And so this is out to tomorrow afternoon. You'll see the surface low here in red, and the wind barbs are showing you, again, mid-level flow. So the mid-level center is here. And see, we have this vertical tilt still in place by this point on the model. But on the GFS, it's able to fully fix that vertical tilt by tomorrow and into early on Friday, and this allows the system to become more coherent and intensify into a hurricane before coming into Hispaniola on this forecast. And this has been a very consistent idea on the GFS, but if we take a look at other models like the HAFS model, which is a hurricane specialized model, as I go in time, and I'll go back to the beginning here, again, you can see the mid-level center here, surface center here, and what you'll notice is that I go through this, we don't really see a full fix of the vertical tilt. It still remains slightly tilted for the next several days into this weekend. And the key timing is about 3 days out from when the track really begins to shift between these two modes, when the track envelopes begin to really diverge from each other. The reason they do that is because as the system is in a weaker state right now, the thunderstorms are not towering as high into the atmosphere. So if we take a cross section of it, so like if you're cutting a cake and you remove one half of it, you're looking at the cross section of the cake. That's basically what we're going to do here between both of these models and what they show out of Melissa. First, taking a look at the GFS. This is that cross section. So as you go further up on the graph on the y-axis, this is the height in the troposphere, and this is distance from points A to B on the x-axis. And what you'll see is that with a stronger storm, what the GFS shows, remember the GFS did, for the most part, vertically stack Melissa. So it's able to intensify more significantly and actually becomes a hurricane on the model before coming into Hispaniola. And what you'll see is that these deep blues and greens extend pretty far up into the troposphere, up to 200 or 300 millibars in the troposphere. But if we compare this to the HAFS model, which shows that vertical tilt persisting with issues over the next few days, you'll see that because of that, it's not able to intensify nearly as much. And the dark blues and greens don't get nearly as high, only up to about 400 millibars in the middle part of the troposphere. And if we look at the flow at the top of the troposphere, the reason why the GFS continuously goes north is because the storms in the hurricane is further up into the troposphere. The hurricane is going to move in the direction that is mean to the atmospheric column. So when it's taller like this, it's going to feel the effects of the upper part of the troposphere more than if it's weaker like on the HAFS model. So for example, you can see that we have this upper trough in this upper part of the troposphere that is dug into the Bahamas and Cuba On the GFS, because it's stronger, it feels the force of this trough more and is lifted north of the Caribbean and into Hispaniola. That's why the GFS consistently does this and moves it into Hispaniola on this forecast. Now, I mentioned that the key timing was about 3 days out. That's when models begin to diverge in their track envelopes. Because pay attention to how fast this trough moves out. You see, this is by Thursday afternoon, and Friday, it's already pushing out into the far North Atlantic. So by this point, if we look further down into the mid-troposphere, which, reminder, that's where much of the steering is that the storm is feeling on these weaker solutions. So if we take a look at the lower or mid-troposphere on this map, you'll see that in the wake of that trough, we've got high pressure building back in over the Bahamas and Western Atlantic. And what this is trying to do is now force the system to stay in the Caribbean. And you might have been able to see it a little bit, the GFS sort of feeling that flow, because after it makes landfall, it weakens a little bit. So the thunderstorms lose height in the troposphere. So it does slow down some on the GFS. Because it's so north, because of its aggressive solution, it ends up still recurving anyways and going north of the Caribbean. But if we look at the HAFS model again, you'll see that by this crucial point, 3 days out, by Saturday, now that ridge is built in. And now it's still pretty far south. You can see it's well south of Haiti and Jamaica by this point. And so now that ridge is catching it and forcing it back west into the Caribbean. So we end up just going southwest, and now we begin to see significant intensification occur by this point. And this is where I start getting into the intensity forecast, because this does get very interesting towards the end of the 5-day forecast period. Now, as I mentioned, shear is forecast to remain rather moderate or high for the next few days, and that will likely keep the system from rapidly developing and rapidly intensifying for the next few days. So for the short term, likely just looking at a tropical storm, maybe weak hurricane as we get to day 3 and day 4. But as the system begins to move towards the west or southwest into the Western Caribbean, now this does partially depend on where exactly it stalls. If it's further north and, say, stalls over land, that may tone down how much intensification we see. But if it's over water, the environment does get much more favorable. And we can see this if we look at the HAFS model. This is, again, that upper level flow plot. And you can see if we go back to now, you have this trough dug in over Cuba and the Western Caribbean. So we've got some of that westerly shear that's impacting the system today. But as that trough lifts out, we begin to see that shear decrease. And if we take a sounding by this point from the HAFS model, you'll see that we don't really have a very significant westerly push of flow anymore at the top of the troposphere. So fairly light vertical shear by this point. And now the waters are very warm, and we really have not had any tropical cyclones come through this part of the Caribbean this entire hurricane season. And the waters are very warm, 29 to 30 degrees Celsius, and ocean heat content. So the extent that this warmth at the surface extends down with depth in the ocean, that's very high in the Western Caribbean. And that is also usual. The Western Caribbean is notorious for having the deepest, warmest water in the entire basin. And now this leaves potential for, if it does remain over water and does take this track, which does seem to be the consensus now today, just from what we just talked about with track implications, now this leaves room for very significant intensification up to day 5 and beyond day 5. And you see it on the model, this begins to rapidly intensify, and we see the pressure number lower very quickly on this model forecast down to the low 900s. Now, don't pay too much attention to the exact values here. There's still a lot of uncertainty. Again, it could stall over land. It could come further north. That could interrupt how much intensification we get. But this shows the potential volatility of the environment that the system may have with the current now track consensus. I could show you the new track consensus here in this great map from Tomer Berg online. He has a website, polarweather.com. I highly recommend checking it out if you want to see plots like this. And this is a mean of all the ensembles. So the European, the UK, the GFS ensemble, the Canadian ensemble put into one map. And if you looked at this yesterday, we had a pretty good divergence and even split in the model ensemble track of tracks going into Hispaniola and tracks staying north or south of Jamaica. Now that has shifted quite a bit. We're seeing an increased probability of the storm tracking west, staying south of Jamaica on this ensemble forecast. And really, in terms of deterministic models, the GFS is alone in its idea of having this quickly intensify and recurve in Hispaniola. There's still a chance that does occur. We still need to see how the system does behave over the next couple of days. If it does get vertically stacked and start to intensify into, say, a hurricane in the next couple of days, then that would be a scenario where the GFS may be right there, and we may take that trek north of the Caribbean, and we may avoid the very favorable Western Caribbean. But with the current state that we've seen, the GFS has been consistently overdoing the forecast on Melissa, and the system is still very clearly being sheared, which will likely keep the system from rapidly developing and will likely keep this vertical tilt going in some fashion for the next few days. And so putting all that together, we now have the new forecast from the Hurricane Center. And this is now taking the ensemble approach of the western side of the envelope. So yesterday they were more in the middle between the GFS and the European. Now they're leaning more towards the European side, which other models have come into agreement on over the past day, showing the system come north gradually for the next few days and then begin to make that westward turn on this forecast staying south of Jamaica. But again, it could deviate from that. We could get it close to Haiti. We could get it close to Jamaica, and that could increase the impacts here. And for that reason, we have a hurricane watch for southern Haiti, tropical storm watch for Jamaica, and that tropical storm watch may get updated to a hurricane watch soon for Jamaica. And you can see the intensification as well, intensifying into a major hurricane at the end of the forecast period, reflecting the potential of the very favorable environment that would be in place if it stays over water in the very warm Western Caribbean. So the key message today is still lots of uncertainty. We don't still know exactly what the system is going to do, but some doors are beginning to close. We're getting some clarity on the future of the storm. I think if I had to give my opinion, this Western solution does seem like the most likely now. The GFS does have a bias to overdo storms intensifications, and I think that's what we're seeing right now from the GFS. I think it's just overdoing Melissa as it has been for the past couple of days, and I don't think it's overly likely that we end up going north of the Caribbean. And unfortunately, that means that we do have a strong hurricane potential in the long term. And for the short-term impact, we could see very heavy rainfall in Hispaniola and Jamaica. You can see on the forecast from the Weather Prediction Center, still a wide swath of 100 to 300 millimeters across these zones. It is still a little bit uncertain because we don't know exactly how far north it's going to get before it begins to stall and make that westward turn. But the general forecast does support very heavy rainfall still coming in Hispaniola and Jamaica, and also tropical storm or hurricane force winds with the saturated soils can cause trees to come down and cause significant damage. Now, for long-term impacts, now, of course, it's way too early to get into any specifics here for Jamaica, Cuba, Cayman Islands, even Central America. It's something to watch, certainly for the next few days. I don't typically hype up stuff because, that's not a good thing to do when you have a lot of uncertainty with hurricanes, which we naturally do have. However, in this case, it is something to bear monitoring very closely for the next few days, especially if you're in Jamaica, Cayman Islands, and Cuba, because the environment that does appear to be ahead, if the system does remain over water in the Western Caribbean, does support a favorable phase of intensification that could make this a major hurricane easily. And the Hurricane Center, in their discussion this morning, has even said that at this forecast point, it's a Category 3. Further adjustments, if these track trends continue upwards in intensity, will likely be needed in future forecasts. And the problem with storms in the Western Caribbean is it's got to hit land somewhere. It's impossible virtually for a system to intensify like this in the Caribbean and not hit land somewhere. And so long term, we need to watch this for potential direct impacts of a strong hurricane for Jamaica, Cuba, the Cayman Islands, and even the Bahamas further north in Turks and Caicos, as eventually it will be turning northeast and will likely be seeing the system impact all of these areas at some point. Exactly to the extent of who gets the worst impacts and what exact impacts do we see, that's of course going to be dealt with in time, because we are still at a 5-day forecast now when it just starts this intensification south of Jamaica. So we've got a lot of time to watch this for the next few days. That's the good news here. And the most important thing to do is watch it. Stay tuned to the Hurricane Center website. They'll have advisories on this for the next several days. And I'll, of course, have more videos on this as well as it develops for the next several days. And one more thing I want to note is that long term, the system is going to be going into the Western Atlantic, and that is over 10 days out. So we're not going to talk about that in any detail. What I want to note is that you're probably going to see some model runs like this posted online from the Canadian model, which is showing what would be ex-Melissa by this point coming into the Northeast US as a very strong non-tropical low. Now, there's a lot of probabilities of where the system could go at this point in this range. Because like I said, this is going towards 10 days out in the forecast in what is already in 5 days a very uncertain forecast. And so if you see model runs like this online, don't pay too much attention to them. They're just one deterministic model run. And truthfully, the range of potential locations this could be, this is by, let's go 8 a.m. Eastern time on Halloween, October 31st. You see the Canadian has this coming into New York City. If you look at the GFS model, same time, 8 a.m. Eastern time on Halloween, this is ex-Melissa by this point near the Azores. So we've got nearly the entire Atlantic for an uncertainty range by this point. And what I'm showing you this to show is that deterministic runs are going to be wild for the next few days with what happens in the future of Melissa. And right now, it's not guaranteed at all that this hits, the US, hits Canada, hits the Azores. There's so many different solutions that could occur in the next 10 days with Melissa. And people are going to post it online. They're just going to try and get traction from it. But don't pay too much attention to these deterministic runs because they are deterministic. And these, even the Canadian has differed very significantly from run to run. And if this does become more of a likely scenario or something more of a possibility, then of course we'll talk about that when it comes in, and of course the National Weather Service in the US will discuss it. But for now, this is not a likely scenario in any way. This is just a deterministic model run in long range, which should not really be taken seriously. And you'll likely see these posted online for the next week, as Melissa's going to be around for quite a long time. So just have a bit of caution of that if you're looking at information for the storm online. I want to get that little note in there at the end, but that's all that I've got for today on Melissa. Like I said, I'll have more videos on this for the next few days as this continues tracking towards the north. Stay safe in Haiti, Dominican Republic, and Jamaica as we get some of the short-term impacts. And that's all for now. Thanks for watching.